Dead Space lore in some parts is extremely complex, and its greater questions will live rent-free in many people's heads for years to come. But one question I have long pondered over is, what was the plan of Marker 3A, i.e. the red marker of Aegis VII? What was it trying to achieve during the plot of Dead Space 1 and Dead Space Remake? When I say this, I'm not talking about the macro view purpose of the markers, convergence and the Brethren moons. No, I specifically want to talk about why the red marker seemed to be obsessed with returning to Aegis VII. Why did it want to return to the surface? Why does it seemingly want to calm the Hive Mind? Why doesn't it want to stay on the Ishimura, where it'd be more likely to be picked up by subsequent repair and rescue teams? Or why doesn't it just let Kendra take it elsewhere? Because Kendra could have easily escaped with it, spreading its marker signal elsewhere, possibly on Earth itself, had the marker not encouraged Isaac, through hallucinations of Nicole, to recall the shuttle and bring it to the surface. With the lore of later games in our mind about convergence and the Brethren moon, its objectives in general seem a little confused with the greater objective of later markers regarding convergence, and it's a bit confusing that it wants to be moved further away from an opportunity, and ultimately its decision to be returned to the surface results in its own destruction. If we retroactively consider lore from Dead Space 2 and 3, then none of this makes sense, as it does really seem to be working against convergence. But when assessing this lore, we have to remember that the original structure of this Dead Space story was conceived in 2008, long before later lore about convergence was introduced, and the remake does repackage and retroactively add later lore that can give greater weight to the story. However, as I will show in this video, if we remove the context of later games, I think we can apply Occam's razor and get a rather simple answer as to why the marker wanted to be returned to the surface of Aegis VII. As a cherry on top, I think the remake does a great job and makes some clever choices to weave in some extra lore from later games to give it further weight and relevance within the series. So in this video we will unpack the journey of the red marker in Dead Space 1 and try and understand why it insisted on being returned to the surface of Aegis VII. But before we get started guys, remember that if you like Dead Space lore, then consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I think the best place to start when talking about the red marker is to talk a little bit about its history. Kendra does a great job in both the original and remake by giving us some context as to the marker's origin and why it's on Aegis VII.
They found the first marker in some crater on Earth. That one. That was real. Alien. Enough to inspire Unitology. Our people studied it and reverse engineered this red marker. But they needed somewhere to test it.
The red marker is one of a number of reverse engineered man-made markers, based on the original truly alien marker known as the black marker. The discovery of the black marker is detailed in the novel Martyr, which I personally really enjoyed and would recommend to any Dead Space fan. The black marker was found on Earth in an ancient crater in Mexico, implying that it had come from a comet. This discovery took place in the year 2214, so almost 300 years prior to the events of Dead Space 1. The black marker was eventually lost, though not before a scientist, Michael Altman, was able to mine the blueprints and data from them. In the years that followed, the then government, the sovereign colonies, would reverse engineer copies based on this data, which would produce the 3 red markers. 3 were sent to 3 different planets for testing, one being sent to Aegis VII, and this would be the marker known as Marker 3A, the marker Isaac experiences in Dead Space 1. Anyone familiar with the Dead Space series can see well where this is going. It resulted in an outbreak, and ultimately the site was sealed and records scrubbed. The sovereign colonies would ultimately collapse in the wake of a secessionist war, as well as due to a number of other factors that are detailed in Dead Space 3 regarding their research with the markers, which I won't go over here. However, Sovereign Colony's successor, EarthGov, would appear to be aware of this experimentation, as is suggested by Kendra's in-depth knowledge of the original outbreak and reports, though the site did continue to be sealed by this government. But again, these experiments, the creation of the red marker, seems to have taken place over 200 years ago, And this brings us to the events of Dead Space 1 in 2509, where it is ostensibly the corporate greed of the CEC that led them to begin an illegal mining operation on the off-limits planet. Throughout the game, most of the characters assume that this is an alien artifact. However, one of the big reveals is that this is man-made. However, despite being physically built by humans, ultimately it is an artifact of alien origin that has been built with alien codes and blueprints, and thus its objectives and function are alien as well. Aside from religious belief, the real attraction to these markers and why governments seem to keep building them, as they do again in Dead Space 2, is the capacity it possibly has for unlimited energy. However, in reality, the signals that are given off by the marker actually activates necromorphic tissue, but also manipulates people who are alive and causes them to see things and have a condition known as dementia. And of course, throughout the game of Dead Space 1, we see plenty of people afflicted by this sort of madness, and we hear horrifying stories of what happened on the colony, including the story of Harris, who killed his nurse believing that she was something else. We also have the example of Dead Space Extraction, where a security team is slaughtered by one of their own, who believes that they have been transformed into monsters. This is just one example of the madness that gripped the Aegis VII colony, even before the marker was removed from its pedestal and taken aboard the Ishimura. But in the case of certain people like Isaac and Dr. Kyne, the marker doesn't just drive them mad, rather it tries to manipulate them in a specific way. Again, in Dead Space 2, this type of lore is expanded upon why certain people don't go completely mad, but are instead manipulated, and it is due to their high intelligence.
Manny Worthington, research log 16671. It's the same signal. Dementia and codes and blueprints are all caused by the same signal from the marker. It's the people that are different. Smart people see codes and blueprints, but to everyone else it's just noise. Noise that drives you mad.
In Dead Space 1, the marker therefore seems to speak to Isaac and Dr. Kyne using hallucinations of their loved ones. Before we even meet Dr. Kyne, we can already see his thought process written on the wall of his secret base that we find in the mining deck, writing things like, "should never have been brought on board," and "I must return the marker." When we meet Kyne in person, we learn that he has been told that returning the marker to the surface will appease the Hive Mind, and looking at one of his notepads nearby, we learn that this was told to him by none other than Amelia, his wife, who has also been dead for some time, and we witness him talking to her despite no one being there. Isaac is seemingly manipulated towards a similar goal by hallucinations of Nicole. For most of the game, it isn't clear exactly what this hallucination of Nicole wants, as she cryptically keeps stating, "make us whole," before actively directing Isaac to return the marker to the pedestal on Aegis VII after he has been betrayed by Kendra.
Bring back the marker and we can return it to Aegis VII. You can make us whole again.
We also have to consider that in the new lore of the remake, the marker is also manipulating Dr. Cross in the same way, as at the end of the game it is revealed that the person we've been seeing as Nicole is in fact Dr. Cross, and she has been seeing us as Jacob, and just before she is killed, she mutters things about making us whole, again implying that while we have been working with her, she's been seeing us as Jacob, who has been telling her we need to make the marker whole. The way in which Isaac is motivated to do this is the same way that Dr. Kyne is, that by returning the marker to its pedestal, the Hive Mind and therefore the Necromorph outbreak will be quelled. This is what the marker as Amelia tells Kyne, and as Nicole tells Isaac. But this inevitably leads us back to the question I posited at the beginning of the video. Why? Why does the marker want this? The remake retroactively tried to make more sense of this by adding some additional lore from the later games. For example, in Dead Space 2, we learn that the golden marker manipulates Isaac to come to the marker because he is in fact the last of the Makers, those responsible for its constructions. And in the final battle in Isaac's head, the marker declares that the Makers must be absorbed for convergence to begin. So this type of lore has been retroactively added into the remake, to help explain why this marker didn't cause a convergence event like the one in Dead Space 2 tries to do. When in reality the reason that it didn't originally is because the game was written in 2008 when the ideas of convergence weren't really established. But the remake does do a good job of retroactively adding this lore, as we can find a text log in New Game Plus that is only found in the remake, where Mercer communicates with the marker, presumably through Harris, in which the marker tells him that they need the Makers brought to them. Given that the Makers must have lived about 200 or so years ago, they must clearly be dead, so in theory this explains why this marker doesn't start a convergence event, because it can't absorb its Makers. But again, if this marker cannot cause a convergence event, what are its intentions? What does it want? Well, I think the answer is pretty simple and comes down to its 3 simple words. Make us whole. At this time, Make Us Whole had nothing to do with convergence. In Dead Space 2, Make Us Whole is in reference to both convergence and Isaac being absorbed by the golden marker as he is its maker, thus making it whole. The idea of makers was not present in 2008 when this game was first conceived, and yet Make Us Whole is an iconic line from this game, so it must have something else to do with the general structure of the plot. I believe Make Us Whole in Dead Space 1 is very simple. The Maker has been split into 2 pieces and wants to be made whole again, the pedestal and the marker. Indeed, the marker declares that they have been made whole after we place it on the pedestal.
Thank you, Isaac. I always believed in you.
Nicole.
We're whole again. We are whole.
That's it just wants to be whole again, its 2 pieces recombined. In all honesty, I think understanding the motivations of the red marker is far easier if you tune out the lore of Dead Space 2 and 3 and you just forget about convergence. So let's strip out all the macro lore about convergence, makers and the Brethren Moons, and we are left with a very simple story. Here is a semi-sentient alien artifact pleading with us to be returned to its pedestal, to be made whole, and that's it. Yes, we can shoehorn some lore from later games to add some relevance to its actions and to tie it in better with the series. And this is something I think the remake does very well, in regards to the maker codes that are revealed to be imprinted in Isaac's brain when we get to Dead Space 2. And I think the remake tries to emphasise that the marker is imprinting something in Isaac's brain, a focus that wasn't given in the original Dead Space for obvious reasons. I think the remake does emphasise this as one of its motivations, and at the exact moment that it is placed on the pedestal and sends out its shockwave, Isaac falls to his knees, and we clearly see marker code running through his head. This moment where Isaac falls to his knees, grasping his head and seeing code flash everywhere, isn't present in the original game. And the way that Dead Space 2 is tacked on to the end of Dead Space 1's story, it's more as if Isaac has been passively receiving these codes with his contact with the marker throughout the game. But the remake emphasises this one single moment where the marker seems to really implant and imprint its codes in his brain. Indeed, some of Nicole's metaphorical dialogue does imply that this is what the marker is wanting to achieve by being returned to the surface.
I've seen it. With this pedestal. Why there?
It amplifies. The marker's pulse will be felt across the planet. The dead will sleep, and the living will see what can't be forgotten.
The dead will sleep, the necromorphs will be put to rest, and the living will see that which can't be forgotten, i.e. marker codes and blueprints. So I think it is satisfying that if we conclude that the marker wanted to be made whole and needed to be made whole, so it could fully implant marker blueprints and codes in his head, and given that this marker couldn't cause a convergence event due to the lack of its makers being alive, its own destruction is therefore a fair price to pay if Isaac can now be used to create new markers. He can leave Aegis VII with marker codes in his brain, and indeed, judging by the events of Dead Space 2, that is a successful plan. However, it is intellectually dishonest to argue that this was always the intent when the original overall plot of the 2008 game was constructed. So to conclude, I believe the original conception of the story as it was made in 2008 was that the marker simply wanted to be returned to be made whole again, and its singular driving purpose was to be returned to its pedestal, to be made whole. However, retroactively in the remake, its actions have been explained to make more sense. Convergence is now mentioned frequently, and Mercer keeps banging on about the fact that the marker hasn't yet caused convergence, and in that text log I mentioned earlier, it's revealed it can't because it cannot absorb its makers. And thus, it seems like a sensible plan that if it can't cause convergence, that this marker will instead imprint blueprints in a survivor's head, someone intelligent enough to bear its consequences, and they'll be able to build new markers from that code. But to be able to do so, to have its signal strong enough to imprint what it needs in someone's brain, it needs to be put on its pedestal, so its signal can be powerful and complete enough to imprint properly in Isaac's brain. So thanks guys, that is my take on why the marker wanted to be returned to Aegis VII, combining what the original intent would be in my mind with the new remake lore, which I think does a fantastic job of tying it better into the Dead Space saga. If you like this video, then consider giving it a like and subscribe, as I will be covering Dead Space lore for the foreseeable future. But until next time guys, I will see you on the colony of Aegis VII. Take care and have a wonderful night.